All right, welcome back, everybody. My name is Jeff, and I am joined by Gabriel Miller. How's it going, Gabriel?
Delightful, man. Thanks for having me.
Awesome. So, you are the author of the upcoming new Infinity novel, Death Song. So, that is naturally what we're here to talk about because I'm very, very excited to get some more Infinity novels, juicy lore. It's my favorite thing. And I understand that you're very excited to talk about it, so we're gonna get into it here a little bit.
Excited, terrified, all of the above.
Awesome. Yeah. I mean, that's what I like. I like to hear it. Um, so before we kind of get into the novel itself, can you just kind of give us a little bit of background on yourself and your experience specifically with writing and kind of give us an idea of anything you've worked on up until this point or how you got into writing?
Yeah. So I've been a storyteller forever. My folks like to tell a story of me as a kid on stage, like just loudly screaming my lines and involving the audience. That as a kid led into theater and then into what we all lovingly know as tabletop RPGs and Dungeons and Dragons. And very quickly, I realized that I don't like being the player quite as much as I like being the storyteller.
The Forever GM.
Yes, actually had a stream called the Forever GMs for a while during the pandemic. That's how we kept all our friends involved.
Awesome.
Uh, so I wrote a bit through college, which was high school in the 90s and then in the military and then in college. And I wrote a bit through college, did some, if you remember, physical print magazines, did some short stories and stuff like that, but nothing that's available these days. But last two Adepticons ago, I was sitting in the Infinity panel next to some random nerd and was just talking about how I had just read the book Downfall by Mark Barber, and I loved it and I wish there were more. And he said, well, why don't you write one? And so Brandon, my editor, and I hit it off really, really quickly. Took me a while to get over myself and, get past that imposter syndrome. But uh, here, a year and a half later, the book is out. I'm already working on book two. It's been a journey, man. This is my first full length novel. So it's been a learning experience and a delightful chance to pour my heart and soul into a universe that I love.
Awesome. Yeah, I was gonna ask how you got hooked up with Wigan Hazard and CB, but shout outs to Brandon. I've had him on to chat about some of the logistics and the process for getting these books into our hands, and it sounds like it's quite the endeavor. So, congratulations on going through that process for the first time and getting a book that will be in our hands any day now. That's very exciting.
Yeah, thanks, man. We're what 2 days away from release, so it's
This will
exciting.
probably be going up like 2 days after release, so I think when anybody's listening to this, they'll be able to go pick the book up and crack into it for themselves. So that's pretty awesome.
Even more exciting.
Yeah, exactly. I know you're also a Infinity player, and
Absolutely.
by all accounts, somewhat well known in the Infinity community. So, can you tell us a little bit about your kind of history with the game and how you got into it?
Sure. I was playing ironic because of the channel I'm on right now. I was playing a game of Malifaux in a league, and I was sitting there across from a guy who wound up becoming a dear friend of mine named Chris, and he had an Infinity game immediately after his Malifaux game, and I'm like, whoa, what's that? That looks really cool. And so I stuck around, and a couple of days later got a demo, and then I did another one and another one and another one. And next thing you know, I have absorbed everything publicly available because of who I am as a human. And
We're kindred spirits there.
yeah, so I threw myself fully into Ariadna, which, if you're an Infinity player, you know that werewolves and dudes in camouflage are a lot of fun. But here over the last year, my heart and soul has been poured into JSA, into the Japanese secessionist army, because of the book I've been writing. So I realized that I write a lot better when I'm playing the models that I'm writing about. So I've actually only been playing Infinity for, I guess we're a little over 3 years now. So not too terribly long. It just happened to really, really captivate me as a narrative and a universe. The game mechanics are so uh, back and forth that it's always your turn mantra really, really stuck with me. And I just haven't looked back, man.
It's funny because I've always said that there's a lot of crossover between the Malifaux community and the Infinity community. So it's great to hear that was kind of your shoe in the door because if anybody's listening to this and either plays Infinity and doesn't play Malifaux or plays Malifaux and doesn't play Infinity, you should go check out the other because you'll probably find something to like in it.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I think there's a lot that appeals to the same type of players for sure. Um, so I guess with that, tell us a little bit about Death Song and what we can expect. We are not going to be getting into spoilers here, just so that everybody is aware. You can listen to this without worry. We're not spoiling anything. Maybe we'll come back later and do some spoilery stuff. But for now, we're just talking the basics. So tell us a little bit about the book.
Well, I wrote the pitch for Death Song having kind of a rough idea of what the story was. I had some basics. There's during the Japanese uprising when they rebelled and became their own faction. They rebelled away from super space China, essentially the Yuqing state empire. Uh, in the uprising book, written by Corvus Belli, the like campaign lore book, there is a section from a character named Bianca Chen. She's a war gore, she's a reporter, and she's got the scoop that ignites the flame of this rebellion. How Japanese soldiers were being ill spoken of and ill treated by Yuqing high command. And that story really started these gears turning. And then as I continue reading through the Uprising book, we get through the story. The rebellion is mostly question mark successful, but they lose the island of Korimori, which was the island on a planet called Shentang in Yuqing space. It was the heart and soul of the Japanese peoples. It was the crown jewel in their society, and they lost it, had to abandon it. The emperor was smuggled out. Many many Bothans died to bring us this information. And one of my favorite parts of being in theater was improvisation, was yes and. So every time I read a book, I still get this yes and. What's next? What happens after that? And I was fascinated by the uprising story and I wanted to know what happened next. When I started writing this book, the Japanese faction was only one faction. It was one sub faction. There were no Shinden Butai, which is their second sub faction, wasn't even out yet. And so we have this list of characters, this list of units. Well, what happened to them? Who got left behind? Who was born on Korimori and then had to leave it and could never go back? What sort of scars does that leave with a person, with a warrior? What sort of baggage does it leave them with that they have to explore? Fast forward to picking a pitch to send to Brandon, my editor. I came back to Oyama, who is the samurai character that you can play, one of a few, but he's the heavy infantry warrior carrying two swords, and he's got a rifle, and he's large and in charge. Maybe not the most badass of all the characters in the faction, but definitely up there. But he has a nickname, Neko. Takeshi Neko Oyama. And so, as I mentioned, I was in the military, and I remember getting nicknames from my compatriots, some of them flattering, some of them not. And I just imagine this samurai walking around and somebody going, "Hey, kitten, what's up?" And this whole conflict with this nickname started building in my head. And then I started exploring, who is this character? And if I keep going any further, I'm going to start getting into spoilers. So the I'm excited about it. I'm excited to hear what other people think and to see this world come to life in other people's heads and get them to ask, yes, what's next? Yes, and.
Yeah, it's funny that you reference Star Wars because that's one of the classic things with Star Wars of like every character in the background, you could go find a book about them and learn all about the their backstory and stuff, and it's awesome to see the same thing happening with Infinity. I think in the little bit of lore we have about Oyama so far, we were told that the reason he got that nickname was that he's been through several different engagements that were like he was the only survivor or one of two, I think, in one case. So that's like he's the cat because he always lands on his feet type of thing. Is that a theme that
Absolutely.
we can expect to carry forward, or are we dangerously walking up to the line of spoilers here?
We're gonna toe the line here.
Okay.
Being the only one to walk away from a traumatic experience carries its own scars. And as I mentioned before, it carries baggage. And that is something we see Oyama struggle with very early in the story. His growing legend, he is becoming a hero to everyone around him. But what does he feel about that? And how does he feel like the loss of all of his allies, his compatriots, his team members? Does he feel like that's something to be lauded that he survived and they didn't? In Japanese culture, and before I go too far talking about Japanese culture, like I'm a white guy, full acknowledgement here. I am not an ambassador for the Japanese people by any means. I did a lot of research, and I had uh, a Japanese speaking individual, first generation American, I believe, if I remember correctly, that helped me through a lot of this through asking questions of his family and reaching out to folks that he knew that were connected. But in that culture, cats are often associated with the afterlife as well. And so here we have this nickname with Takeshi being nicknamed not only for luck, but also, what is this negative connotation that may come from it as well? It's an interesting line to walk for anyone. You say you survive a traumatic incident and become a hero. Well, what do you think about all the people that got left behind? And survivor's guilt and PTSD are very, very real things. And our fictional characters have that too.
Yeah, it's something that some of the other novels have touched on to a slightly lesser extent. But that's fascinating because you you think of a lot of the characters in Infinity almost like superheroes, where they're like these larger than life figures that are, maybe they have some flaws or something, but you don't really think of them as being internally torn. So, some you do, but largely they're these like superhero type figures. So it's fascinating to deal with some of those issues of like, how is all these things that they're involved in going to change them as a person and potentially, be very difficult for them to live through.
Oyama is mentioned as a sergeant in a lot of the lore that we had until Death Song. And chronologically, Death Song happens after the Concilium Accords. So after there's a peace with the alien combined army that comes in. So this is 7 years after, yeah, 7 years after the uprising. Is he still a sergeant? Even that question, like these people advance, they move forward in their lives as well. They're not going to be stuck in the same job forever. If I was in the military for over 7 years and still just a sergeant, they would have just kicked me out at that point. Like, you're not going to advance, just go. And so at this point, Oyama is actually a sergeant first class, but we don't have that yet. That was a conversation between myself and Gutierrez actually to figure out where is he now. Who we think of him as this noble Damaru Butai, this noble samurai character, but nobility has tiers, right? So where does he fit in that? Because it matters. And so we've come to find out he's from a noble family, but not like imperial court nobility. He's not way up there. He's kind of a mid to low rank noble family. So these characters, these heroes that we have in our stories, they all have their own lives in the background. And that's one of the great things about novels and these long form stories is we get to explore that.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. So you mentioned that you really dove deep once you got into Infinity, but I'm curious. You make a pitch to Brandon. You're having conversations about writing this whole novel. How much of the lore had you already absorbed up until that point? And was there any like homework that you had to do to study up and really, in terms of like just the internal lore of Infinity, not to mention the broader Japanese culture that you have.
Yeah.
But how much homework did you have to do? How much did you have to dig through RPG source books and stuff like that to feel comfortable uh, jumping into this?
I started without too terribly much additional research. I had already read everything that was published at the time, with the exception of the RPG books. I had not read all of
They're
those.
dead.
I'd read some of them, but not all of them. But I'd read all the campaign books that were published at the time. I had read all of the N4 lore book that came out in companion with the rule book. I read uh, by Fire or Downfall and Code Z and Aragart, the novels that were out to that point, and then I went back and read them again because there you will always find something new when you reread. Uh, I realized that Bianca Chen, that reporter character that I was talking about, was also in End Song, but I had missed it the first time. I didn't realize that that was the same character. The reason why that's important is she is also in the novel as well. So they got to make sure that I'm tying all that in correctly. And there was, even after it was done, there was some fact checking and some lore confirmations that I needed to make. And some of those went to Corvus Belli. And then there was also some cultural questions that I sent to Masato. And it was a constant process, constantly researching, learning.
Yeah. The wider the universe gets and the more they've got, we've got animes coming up, we've got novels, we've got source books and RPGs and all this different stuff, the harder it becomes to write anything because there's so many different things you have to make sure that nothing conflicts. So it's good. It sounds like Corvus Belli was pretty hands-on with, helping you double check that stuff. So that's definitely good to hear.
Especially as we came towards the end of the process, there was a lot of, well, we need to check this that we went through. And there was a lot of stuff where there's a lot of power and leeway that you have working in an existing franchise because it frees you up to not have to create everything. When you can sit back and say, okay, the name for this thing already exists. So I can just put insert space station name here in brackets, and then I can come back and worry about that later. And I can just keep writing. So near the end, that's when you go back and you have the thanks to the marketing director at Corvus Belli, Max, I was had a really quick exchange with Gutierre, getting some questions back and forth and getting those clarified just to make sure that what we talked about in the beginning was either still accurate or was still. I'm trying not to affect the timeline too much, and I don't want to throw the boat off course by a single comment in a novel. So there's a lot of freedom you have to just keep writing and then go back and check it later. And for me personally, that was very empowering because I didn't have to come up with the entire world. I didn't have to invent, okay, how does magic work? How does travel work? How does, what is the day night cycle of this mythical place that I'm inventing? I could just lean on what was already there and then really focus on the characters within that universe.
Yeah, which is the sort of strong point of a novel, I suppose, is the
I
it,
certainly hope so.
well, what I mean is compared to what we already have, right? Like in
Agreed.
the rest of Infinity, we there are characters and we hear about some folks, but you don't get a really deep dive into individuals. It's more about the world building and the sort of bigger picture stuff. The novels are where we've really seen the digging into the people and the individuals. So that's obviously being
Absolutely.
able to just focus on that is a huge asset, I think.
I agree.
If you're enjoying this video and you want to support the channel, then there's a couple of different ways that you can do that. The first would be to pick up some merchandise through my merch store. You can grab a t-shirt, a hoodie, a mug, a sticker, all sorts of cool stuff like that. You can also shop using my affiliate links. So if you're going to make any purchases from any of these companies, you can use the links in the description below to make your purchases, and it will go directly to supporting the channel at no extra cost to you. There's also a link for my Ko-fi if you would just like to give me a tip, or my Patreon if you want to support me longer term. I have a bunch of different tiers there, and there are all sorts of benefits available to people, such as early access to videos, ad-free videos, the opportunity to vote in polls about upcoming content, and extra entries into the giveaways that I run occasionally. But if none of that is your cup of tea, no problem at all. Just make sure that you're subscribed to the channel and leave a like on the video. It actually helps a tremendous amount. And if you want to go the extra mile, then consider sharing the video out with some friends who you think might find it interesting. The YouTube algorithm is not kind to small YouTubers, so that helps a whole bunch. Other than that, consider joining the Discord, also linked in the description, where you can come and hang out with me and the rest of the community and talk games. But with that, let's get right back to the video. So, on a related note, I would imagine that as you're writing this, you're considering that there could be people coming to this novel and it's their first really introduction to the Infinity Universe. We saw it on the main stage at Gen Con. It was shown off, and there's probably folks who play Infinity and don't know a bunch about the lore, although I don't know those people. That sounds crazy to me. But then you also have the people like us who are very, very into the lore and want to really get a lot of the, whether it's Easter eggs or just a really deep look at some of the different aspects of the lore that you're touching on. How do you balance those two considerations? Because obviously, if you go too far, the people who are new to it won't understand what's going on. They'll be kind of lost. But if you are introducing everything for the first time, that could kind of drone on and be boring for somebody who's a vet of the lore. So how do you kind of balance those two things?
Action. There's a phrase in storytelling, writing, etc. It's show, don't tell.
Mm-hmm.
And there is a place for telling that has its own strengths and its own uses, but the world around us is experienced through all of our senses. So for Oyama, for instance, if he's walking through a city and he smells a food cart and it makes him think of back home on another planet, but then he gets a message across his lens, his implant, so that he's getting this message direct to his eyeball. Those kinds of things will expand and explore the world around him without saying Takeshi has an implant in his eye and it lets him read this. And oh, by the way, he was born here and he likes hot dogs and yada, yada, yada.
Yeah.
So there is a place for telling. If you see a tag, a big giant, Gundam vibe robot, right? Uh, they're running around in the world, and if you see one parked in a ready position, it's there as a quick reaction force or something. He might see that and think, oh, that's a quick reaction force. I can tell by the way that they're geared up and they're ready to go and they're powered and they're just waiting for the call. That is a moment where you start to get a whole lot of depth of, oh, if Takeshi knows about this, then he recognizes that. So now you're getting more of the world around him just by him expanding on what he sees, rather than me writing a novel of me writing a novel of
Exposition, right.
facts. Right. That is one of the larger science fiction publishers out there in the wargaming community, who will not be named. A lot of their recent novels toe the line between that, between exposition and action. And personally, I feel like it detracts a lot from the story. And so that was something that I tried really, really hard not to do. You don't need me to drone on and on about the weather cycles and the why does it take 2 weeks to get from Earth to Shentang or wherever we're going. You would much rather know about what Takeshi is seeing and experiencing. And that's how we bring in the new folks. They don't want exposition. They don't want a dry 30-page document on what the world looks like. They they want to see it through the character's eyes.
So, do you think this should be relatively approachable for someone if they're brand new to Infinity, if they don't know much about the lore at all? Is this a good kind of jumping off point, you think?
I tried from the beginning. I worked very hard to make sure that it was approachable for somebody who didn't have a clue. There were a couple of times where I took a passage to my wife and said, "What do you see?" And my darling wife is a huge fantasy nerd, but not so much on the sci-fi. And when she could understand what was happening, I knew I was explaining it well while still keeping the action moving and keeping the scene moving forward. And there are a couple of spots throughout the book, um, circulars, the spaceships that travel between star systems. You can't just say, "Oh, I'll hop on a circular and I'll be there in a week," right? You need a paragraph. Give them a paragraph. There's a place where it's appropriate,
Yeah.
but not always. It can detract from the story a lot if you're not careful.
Yeah. Very cool. So you mentioned that you've read the other novels. I assume that by now you've read By Fire and Sword, because I think that came out since you started working on this, right?
Absolutely.
Do you have any kind of favorite bits of any of those novels? And was there anything that you took? I mean, you mentioned that this is your first like full length novel that you've written. So was there anything that you thought that you wanted to incorporate or kind of pointer, things that you learned from reading those books about the sort of process of writing or the structure of the novels that you wanted to incorporate into Death Song?
Interesting. I think I would focus more on story beats than structural. Uh, every bit of writing takes on a life of its own and grows. The original pitch of Death Song and the final product of Death Song, you can tell that they came from the same thing, but it grew and evolved over the course of writing the project. One of the things, theme from another book that I really, really loved by John Libby, it's Aragart. There is a Pan-Oceanian soldier who's been disgraced and thrown kind of to the wolves as private security for a character at the very beginning of the book. And he gets thrown to the wolves once again by having to live with backwoods Caledonians, having to live on Dawn with the Ariadnans who don't have constant connection to technology, and they're not connected to the futuristic sci-fi world that is Infinity. It's almost like going back in time for him. And so very much a fish out of water. He was not in his element. And I loved that theme. John did a really, really good job of exploring that. And so there are definitely some moments where Takeshi finds himself very out of water and very out of his element. And those were really, really fun to explore. I also enjoyed By Fire and Sword um, had an action scene. Oh man, I'm going to blank on the details now. There's an action scene in By Fire and Sword where they technically accomplish the goal, but a lot goes wrong and it leads to later conflict. And that is something that I really enjoy. It's once again, yes, and it happened, but
Is it the battle at the beginning where they're in like a hotel?
no, though that was phenomenal.
That was a strong
uh,
opening of that book.
yes, it was. No, it was when they're attacking a Morat facility.
Okay.
and they're there, and then they realize, oh hell, there are prisoners here,
Mhm.
and then they work to set those prisoners free. And I'm not going to say anymore because I don't want to spoil anything else here. But it leads to the final conflict of the story, and there's these little like characterful moments where uh, um, is it Hawkins,
Mhm.
John Hawkins, the hospitaller. He leads with his gut. He does what he believes is right, and it creates some complications. And there's definitely a moment in Death Song where Takeshi does that.
I think that's a good way to summarize him as a character. Is he leads with his heart and it causes problems.
Yes. Yeah, Mark did such a great job with that character. He was so rigid and uptight at the beginning of Downfall, and then as we got to or not Death Song, Jesus, by Fire and Sword, he's been in this relationship with this very, very complicated individual, and it's expanded his thinking as well as his experiences and growing through them. And now he's running around with Gabriel DeFierson doing these black ops missions, and he's just so conflicted through it.
Well,
Mark,
and also the fact that like I think some of his worldview is sort of shattered without spoiling like the ending of the first of Downfall, but
oh,
you know, some bad
100%.
things happen that he was like, "Oh, the world is not the way that I thought the world was." And I think that's a
Yeah.
really interesting aspect of it too. Yeah.
And there is some allegory there
Yeah.
with the story of Death Song and what winds up happening to Takeshi.
Very cool. So we sort of touched on this a little bit, but you know, again, a novel is a sort of unique opportunity in this universe to focus on characters and character arcs and their backstory and their motivation and all these different things. Now, obviously, Oyama is going to be a huge focus of this, and you've already touched a little bit on, you know, what he's up to and what we can expect. But are there any other big characters that are going to take a sort of front facing role in this story that you can tell us about?
There are three primary protagonists. We have Takeshi. There's Mizu, who is an Aragoto biker for the tabletop equivalent. And then there's a couple others that pop up. Bianca Chen, as I mentioned earlier, the War Core is a connective piece through a lot of the lore books. She's a lens through which we see the world of Infinity, character created by Gutier from Corvus Belli, and she is one of the primary points of view of this novel. There are a few other characters. The only one that I will mention is that Jaspir from Hassas and Baram is present for reasons.
Interesting. I wasn't
That's
expecting
on the back
that.
cover of the book. That's on the back cover of the book.
Okay.
So I'm not giving away the goose there. But there are some other stories. The character of Nakama was a lot of fun. There are two Imperial agents that show up throughout the book, and their various characters were a lot of fun to work with. And I'm gonna stop there before I say something I shouldn't.
Fair enough. Fair enough. So, what do you think makes a good character in Infinity? Because again, considering what we've already talked about, where there's a lot of characters in Infinity that we know of, but until the novels and I guess the graphic novels as well, we should mention those in addition. We didn't really get much in terms of developing any of those characters. So, what do you think what are some of the challenges with introducing characters or developing existing characters in the setting, and what do you think makes for a good character in Infinity?
A challenge would be being respectful to the progression of the storyline that's already happening. Uh, Working with Oyama, working with Bianca and Jaspir and these other named characters in the world, I wanted to make sure that I was being very respectful of the vision that Corvus Belli has for those characters. I get a lot more room to play with the others. There's a character named Sparrow who you meet throughout the book, uh, and a cast of other characters that have a tabletop equivalent, but aren't necessarily named characters in the game that we know. being respectful of the ones that do exist and the vision that they want to have is super important. But even in then, there is a story that you want to tell with them. There is a direction that I wanted Takeshi to go, and we made sure to make sure that that still aligned with where he's going long term for Corvus Belli. As far as what makes a character good, um, flaws and the ability to overcome them. When we meet Mizu at the beginning of the book, it's literally chapter one. She is on a drug run. So,
Excellent.
how did she get there? What did she have to overcome to get to that point? And what does she have to overcome to get to the end of the book? There's a big theme throughout the book of going home. And, what does she need to do in order to be able to go home? Uh, Oyama, what are his flaws? I mean, he's a noble samurai. He sees the world in black and white. Well, it has a whole lot of other color too, and not all of it's pretty. And his reaction to Mizu and her gang that surrounds her is creates this beautiful tension for a decent chunk of the book. And their ability to see that challenge and overcome it despite their own character flaws is really important. Anytime you're writing, if you have a superhero character who never gets hurt, it gets real old. For me personally, Superman was always boring.
There's a reason Joan of Arc is not a protagonist of any of the novels, I would imagine. she's kind of like,
but what if, right? Hear me out. What if she has the same conflict within her that Achilles had before he switched sides, but she chose a different path? She's this anybody listening who doesn't know who Joan of Arc is, Joan of Arc is a character in the game who was recreated by an AI. They took a construct of a theoretical personality and built it into a person.
Based on the historical figure of Joan of Arc, yeah.
Exactly. So what if she's a person, she might be full of zeal and religious fervor and doing what's right, but also she's human. Mostly.
Yeah.
So what are her conflicts? What are the things that toy with her in the back of her mind?
Well, it's funny because most of the characters in the setting, especially if they're aligned with Pano, they kind of look at her as this like shining example of the epitome of all of their values, and she's very much like a superhero to most people. So actually, I guess telling a story that humanizes her might be very interesting.
Well, it won't be my next book, but it is in the back of my head a little bit. And I mean, we all need a new Joan sculpt, right? Joan of Arc has how many models now? Like 5 or 6.
Yeah.
But yeah, there's all of these different characters. They have flaws, even if they're not seen in the lore book. They're still there. So what are they, and can they overcome them? Well, I'm all over the place with answering your questions. I seem to do this in every interview.
That's the point. I'm here to set you off and let you go. That's my job. You answer how you see fit. You mentioned before, it's funny because you've already preempted like several of the questions that I had planned to ask, but that's usually the sign that we're that it's going well, I think. You mentioned that you did a little bit of, or quite a bit of research into sort of Japanese culture, and to tie that in, because obviously that's a big part of the character's backstory. Infinity, in several different ways, in even other ways, is an interesting mix of like it's obviously a futuristic sci-fi setting with all this advanced technology and different planets and stuff, but it ties a lot of real world historical stuff into that, and sort of extrapolates on things that have happened in the real world. It's not so far in the future that it's like a Star Trek thing where it's very disconnected from our world that we live in. How do you tie those things in together obviously Corpse Belly has laid the sort of groundwork with a lot of that stuff, and they've established how some of the stuff works in the future. But as you were reading up on some of the historical stuff that you're working with here, how do you tie those things together in a way that feels authentic?
Man, that was a tough one. Um, One of the things that science fiction genre requires is a suspension of disbelief. We think about that with fantasy. There's dragons. What? Of course, there's dragons. It's fantasy. We just believe, we accept that. With science fiction, we still have to accept facts that we look at in the real world and go, wait, what? Alien race shows up, all powerful AI, resurrection, liquid ammunition for guns, hacking on the fly from a wrist device, a cell phone essentially installed in your eye. There's all these things that there's some plausibility to it, but where we are right now, we have to suspend disbelief to accept that this is a real thing. And Infinity makes that kind of challenging sometimes because their timeline is the human experience up until nowish, and then it takes a left turn and goes a different direction.
I think that's why it's so interesting. I love that part of it, but it seems
Agreed.
very challenging
Agreed.
to work with.
It, it creates an opportunity to take real world things and relate them to a science fiction setting in a more tangible way. One example that I use is there's a literally a pair of friends who share tea at one point in the novel, and they talk about how they're doing this. It's a ritual for them. They do it every time they meet, and then you realize about halfway through the scene that this is a couple of like murderous assassin characters. You're like, wait, what? The juxtaposition of being behind enemy lines, and these two characters are taking a minute to share tea. There's this just absurdity of it, but then you look at like the tea ceremony in uh, Japanese and many other Asian cultures. The tea ceremony is such a sacred thing and such an important piece of historical important piece of culture historically, that you can then turn it and apply it into this sci-fi setting and then just throw a couple of weird twists on it and have some fun. You want to make sure when you do that that you are being respectful of it. One great example of that is the old JSA symbol was a take on the rising sun from what was the World War II era Imperial Japan flag. There's a whole lot of negative context that comes with that, and so Corvus Belli took that symbol, this idea that they had, and they went, "Well, we need to change this to be respectful of the culture and respectful of the historical context that comes with that." And so in Death Song, there was a moment where, as I was writing the original draft of the book, there's this garden where there is that kind of rising sun burst, and it each of the rays reach out and touch a different part and piece of the culture, and it's a very visual representation. And then I went, "Oh, that was bad." So yeah, I had to go back and change it and rework with it. But that's one, to go back to what I said earlier, I found that very empowering because I could write the thing and then fact checking it when it came to Japanese culture was a way for me to really make sure that this tale was authentic as can be when it's written by a white dude who lives in Kentucky. I've my only claim to Japanese culture is I've been there a couple of times and I love it. Um, I do not try to represent myself as an expert by any means. So I wanted to make sure that I was being as authentic as I could. But then again, we're in a science fiction setting, so there has to be a little bit of suspension of disbelief.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to look at it, that, some of these things are going to be, you have to take some things with a grain of salt, but also trying to be as authentic as possible is obviously super important. Was there anything that you learned about Japanese culture through the process of writing this book that was particularly interesting to you?
At first, it started out with just language. It's like, hey, does this really mean what I think it means? Because the Japanese language, there's a word, and I'm going to blank on it right now. Again, I'm going to blame it on lack of sleep. That means like three different things, and it is just the context of how it's being said that tells you what the difference is. And so, as I'm writing this, there are a few Japanese words that I use. Some of them curse words
Naturally.
that I want to make sure I'm using them at least some semblance of
Right. Plausibly correctly. Yeah.
Yeah, and when I was chatting with Masato, he was kind of trying to explain the difference between these words and how they're not really used, but then they are used by a youthful culture, which fits the context of the character that's saying them. Um, but there was so much in the language that I think my brain really, really focused on. Okay, how does this work? That all of the other facts that I absorbed were just kind of ancillary as a part of the process. I did do a lot of research on Bosuzoku, which are Japanese biker gangs. Um, had very little real world window into that culture, but did as much research as I possibly could because the Aragoto from the tabletop game are an allegory to that culture and that lifestyle.
And also some very sick models, just to throw it out there.
Yes, abso-friggin-lutely.
I love all the bikes in Infinity, but that's a particular favorite of mine for sure.
Yeah. Now I do have connection to it and a window into American motorcycle clubs and culture, and so I wanted to make sure that my assumptions from that, I don't want to superimpose an American cultural reference onto a Japanese cultural point, even if they are similar in some respects. So it was a journey, man. It really was. The language being the biggest piece that I really wanted to make sure I got right, even though I only used a couple of words. It's really easy to write a book where the very first review is, oh, yeah, just another white dude writing a story about cyber samurai.
Well, and we've all experienced it when you read something that was not originally done in your native language, and you see like, oh, this person didn't really understand how to translate this correctly. You see something that's just a little off, and it's like, I get what they were going for, but that doesn't mean what you thought it meant, and it can be kind of frustrating. So we've all, I feel like we can all appreciate that, at least to an extent.
I'm sure a native Japanese speaker will see something that I wrote and go, "Oh, are you sure that means what you think it means?" Like that is inevitable.
But we also have the benefit of a couple hundred years of history to say, well, the language is adapted, it's developed and evolved in that time.
Speaking of the in publishing, there's always a style guide when you work with different publishers, and like, hey, some of them you want to keep it. You can write a rated R book. Some of them you have to keep it PG-13. And with Winged Hussar, Brandon, the editor, said, if you want to use the F word, you're going to have to convince me. And I wanted to use the F word a lot. These are soldiers and biker gangs and yakuza, right, and these characters that are like, they are not going to be prim and proper.
Right.
Like they are the underside of the underside of what's going on here. And so I made up my own because language evolves and it changes. And that was a fun thing to be able to do, to make up a curse word and insert it into the language and then reference where it comes from in the book somewhere.
Very cool. I always love stuff like that. It makes it feel more like the culture is its own actual real living culture when you get little bits like that. I know, like Firefly famously, they did a bunch of cursing.
Goram.
Yeah, right. They had their own, but then there was like Chinese curses and stuff, and that was always one of the fun things I thought about that show for sure.
And man, pour one out for Firefly. Gone before its time.
Don't even get me started.
Yeah. Or Battlestar Galactica and frack. You know,
Yeah.
those words are out there.
Yeah.
So we have one for infinity now.
Excellent. I love it. Hopefully it catches on in the community and we can all start using it at events. I don't know if this is a harder question or an easier question. I was going to say this should be easier, but maybe it'll be harder because you already know a lot of Infinity lore. But was there anything that you knew that you learned about Infinity lore as you were going through the process of writing this? You had the lore master, you had his ear, so, you know, was there any...
I mean, I don't want to misconstrue. It's not like I was calling Gutierre every week, you know?
Fair.
I had a pretty direct line to him near the end just to make sure everything was correct. And I had a great experience working with him. It was phenomenal. I'd say the thing that I found the most fascinating in the conversation that he and I had, and this is going to get into the weeds. There's a moment where I use this words plasmatic explosion and describing a detonation that occurs. And he and I had to work out, like, how does that work? And, you know, in Infinity, we have these fusion fuel cells. Like, I've got a shaker bottle right here in front of me. Like, this could literally be a miniature star in my backpack powering my armor. You know, they're figuring out the details, the little things were the most fascinating to me. I am a minutia guy. My wife looks at me and says, "Yep, you're a Virgo. I know that." Um, I like to know the details, and that was probably my favorite part of really getting into the lore. What is Oyama's current rank? What's his family's rank in the overall society? If he had an interaction with X, what would that interaction be like? Would X write him a note? Would he not? What would happen here? Getting those details right, and then once again with the planet of Shentang and the island of Korimori, the last picture we saw of Korimori was 7 years prior. So in this world of nanotech and new materials and construction processes and drones and all of that, is this still a blown up wasteland, or have they rebuilt it? So I originally thought it was not as rebuilt as it is. And so that was one of the really, really interesting things to learn from Gutierre about what Yuching has done with this island and what their goals are with this island. And so I still found ways to sprinkle in the scars of war. But for the most part, the island's rebuilt. It is now a big air quotes here model civil area. You know, it is a quote booming metropolis, end quote.
or so we're told.
or so that's what Yuching wants you to think.
Yeah. Don't let Bashir hear us talking bad about Yuching.
Oh, he and I had a long conversation about it at Gen Con and at the Krug, and I apologized to him because his boys are not putting their best foot forward in this one.
You know, It's shocking to me that they have not come off very positively in any of the novels so far, and I'm waiting for the Yu Ching book to come, but we'll have to see where things go.
There is a novel in development called The Space Between that I have a lot of hopes for, and there's some Yuching Japan tension there, but there's a window into Yuching that you get a lot more of a picture than what you get from mine, and I'm really excited to see what Matt does with it.
Very cool. Yeah, I guess actually one of the graphic novels had Adil was the protagonist, so
Adil, oh, that would have been Betrayal.
yeah,
Yeah,
I guess
Betrayal.
that sort of counts.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And even in Death Song, you get a couple of different I Ching characters, even if they're not. You get to see different sides of the coin, and there's a really fun moment where Oyama has this realization about what he could have become, uh, that I really really enjoyed.
Very cool. Is there any way that the tabletop game influenced anything in this story as far as how you wrote it or sort of nods to the tabletop that we can look out for?
Absolutely. Absolutely. There is a moment where Takeshi calculates his odds to hit. I'm not joking. there
Does it
there
go
is a
up
moment in it.
by margins of 3 or down by margins of 3?
No, in this particular instance, it's like I've got a 0.0000% chance to do anything useful here.
Yeah.
But there's a moment where he's looking at his weapons and he's looking at this thing ahead of him and he's calculating his odds to hit. And that was just a fun little tabletop analogy
A
because
little nod.
when we play the tabletop game Infinity, we're figuring out, okay, you've got cover, so that's -3, but I've got marksmanship, so I can ignore your -3, and we've got all these different factors that give us pluses and minuses. And one of the things Brandon said to me, again, going back to Brandon from Winged Hussar, is he wanted to make sure that Takeshi wasn't so easily slicing through everything. And I had this moment where he's cutting cleanly through a remote. Not going to say what kind of remote, but a remote. And he slices clean through it, and he's like leaping off a roof, slices through this remote, and like lands through a window and tumbles through a tchotchke shop kind of vibe. It's very much a movie scene kind of moment. And then I pulled up Infinity Dice Calculator and sent it to Brandon, and I went, "This is the unit. This is in Takeshi. This is his turn. This is the weapon he's using. He has a 99% chance of putting this thing all the way to dead. Like as long as he can get there, he can do it.
It's not a stretch. So, listen, he was
yeah.
Unless the tag crit, it was a shirt.
You're right. Well, it wasn't a tag. Not this one. In Infinity, as a tabletop game, there are moments where characters are just. There's moments where, to quote, play on tabletop, where your dice tell stories, where your dice change the narrative. And then there's moments where you go, oh yeah, of course that happened. That's a no-brainer. The odds were very much in my favor. And with the book, there's those moments where characters are heroes and they accomplish more than they should. And then there's those moments where you go, oh, that character has NWI. I can see that you as a tabletop player can absolutely see what's happening. It was a lot of fun to include those little nods in the book.
Yeah, I have to say, across all the novels so far, it's never felt to me like a character was like obviously they're the protagonist, so things are gonna generally go their way because otherwise there wouldn't be a book about them. But I don't think like it has always felt like a real struggle for them to accomplish the things that they wanted to do, and part of that's because a lot of stories are the underdog in some way, but I definitely think that comes through in like things. They don't feel like they're just hacking through everyone and not without a thought for the danger or the what's actually happening. So I think that I think it's good that Brandon highlights that as a concern, because it can feel unrealistic if you get too much of that. So
Oh, absolutely. But there are ways to highlight their tabletop skills without making it feel too over the top. There's a character who likes to flip the middle finger at people in the book, and he keeps getting away with it until he doesn't. And those little moments, you don't want the characters to get away with everything. You want them to struggle. You want them to fail. That's what makes a good narrative. But they need to eventually overcome it and succeed.
yeah. Yeah, and that's kind of how the action and interplays with the actual narrative of the story. So that's always an interesting
Yep.
bit.
I've got a 300 point 5.5 SWIC list of special weapon cost for those that don't play Infinity. I have a tournament legal list of the characters from the book and the strike team from the book.
Nice.
So the tabletop very much influences what happened in this
Can
book.
you share that out once the book is out and it's in people's hands? Because I'd love to see that.
I promised Jay from Warsenal that he could release it first.
Okay.
And then, but once he's done that, I'll send it to you.
All right, awesome. I'll bug Jay so I can get him to send it over to me as well.
Yeah, man.
Last couple of questions here. You mentioned that you originally played Ariadna, and now JSA has been a big focus for you, which is convenient because it's also a big focus with them becoming their own sectorial, or their own faction with their own sectorials. Are you focusing on playing JSA now in your normal games because of your connection with them now? And do you have a favorite Infinity character model specifically? And has it changed?
My favorite model has changed a couple of times. My favorite character, oh man, honestly, I think Mizu is my favorite character, and she's not even a playable character in the book. My favorite character in Infinity, I'd say there's two of them. There is Usha McNeil. She is one of my favorites. She was my favorite at Jump. I think I've got 3 or 4 copies of the Defiance Usha McNeil pinup model that I'm getting different people to paint, different painters to paint, just so I can have a collection. I am a sucker for art, and so I have a collection of busts and models that I've had people paint for me. That's my hoity-toity art thing. I'm also kind of fascinated with Perseus right now, but I am not playing Nomads. So I've been playing a little bit of OSS and Steel Phalanx here lately. So Aleph. I've enjoyed it. It's not captivated me like I thought it would. Might go back to Ariadna, but there's I need to start playing what I'm writing my next book about, and I gotta get to that point. I gotta get them on the tabletop so that I can live that fantasy of them, so that I can really understand who they are and how they work.
Got to immerse yourself in it.
Yeah, very much so.
On that note, can you tell us anything about what you're working on? Is it? I assume then it will not be a direct sequel to this story.
It will not be a direct sequel.
Okay.
And that's all I'm going to tell you for now.
Well, I'll have to twist your arm and get you to come back on, and we'll talk about that when it gets a little closer.
And man, I love as close as I've become to Corvus Belli and as engaged in it as I've become. And so I'm not willing to risk those NDAs, man.
Well,
no spoilers from me.
This is always my favorite question to ask, and it's tricky because of things like you're already working on a new project that you can't speak about. So let's hold that aside for now.
Okay.
Let's exclude that from the conversation. if there was if you could pick any area of the Infinity lore to develop, whether it be through another novel or a short story or any format, something that you're really interested in or curious about that you would really love to be able to expand on, what would it be?
Um, hmm, that's a tough one. U.S. Ariadna. I would love to expand. U.S. Ariadna has been in the N5 that came out. They were sent to Shinju to be the border patrol, which is a little on the nose right now. But they were sent to Shinju to keep the peace between the two different factions in the area, and they were given this plot of land to be their own. So Ariadnan factions are often described as these low tech backwoods junkies. You know, the guys that they look at something in the Quantronic age and go, "Ooh, fancy! What that do?" And then they hop back in their diesel engine truck and drive away. Uh, but our Dawn was discovered almost 20 years ago in the timeline, right? So, what sort of technology have they picked up? What sort of pieces of modernity that have they incorporated into their lives, into their tactics, into their gear? Uh, the factions are all getting flyers right now, aerial units, and there are these jet bikes and the fake ones for um, JSA and the Firebat for O12 and the flyers for Hawk Islam look almost like ornithopters from
Yeah,
Dune. They're
really,
they're all so cool.
really great
What w-
sculpts.
what would Ariadna's flyer look like? Is it you know is it i- is it a quadcopter drone looking thing? We don't know. I want to
My
know.
first instinct was to say it should be a drone. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah,
Maybe I'll
it
play
should
for
be what we understand as a modern
that.
drone, right?
Yeah,
It is just straight up a predator flying flying in the sky, and they strapped a Quantronic processor to it and called it a day. Uh, my buddy Chad, shout out to Chad from Indiana. Um, Chad had this idea of a Ariadne engineer. Just they get handed this super fancy technical piece of equipment, and this Ariadne engineer just starts ripping components out like useless, don't need this, etc. And the high tech faction is just looking in horror, and then they're turning it into something they understand and they could use. And that's just such a cool story. I hope he's able to go somewhere with that one.
very cool. Yeah, I mean, you'd expect the technological, like you said, it's been 20 years. You'd expect the technological advancement to be very quick to kind of because they're benefiting
Yeah.
from their contact with the rest of the human sphere. So that will be,
Fingers crossed for him.
yeah, yeah. It'll be interesting to see how that works out for them.
hmm there's so many stories to tell, both inside Infinity and out. I'm loving writing Infinity books, but there's some other franchises and some other stories of my own devising that I'd love to work for too. Uh, so the future is bright, my friend. Sitting down next to Brandon at Adepticon changed my career trajectory, and it I lovingly say that Infinity changed my life, and it's true. It really, really is. So the future is bright, my friend.
Awesome. Well, where can people keep up with you personally, and when can people get their hands on the book, and how do they get it? Tell us all the important things.
So the novel Death Song is available literally everywhere. Um, we are printed and distributed by Simon and Schuster. Winged Hussar Publishing is an imprint of Simon and Schuster, and our collection, the Archives, is becoming our kind of branding for all the Infinity and Warcross stuff to come. That is available literally anywhere Simon and Schuster distributes. So your local bookstore, you can walk in and order it. You can go to Barnes and Noble, Books a Million, any of the big box retailers and order it. You can order it on Walmart's website, Amazon, wherever you want to go. I will, however, give a shout out to the folks that really make the Infinity universe alive in the US here, and that is Warsenal and Interstellar Games and Mo Games, and these folks that have really been our distributors and our sources of all things Infinity. Every one of them can order the book. Even your local game store can go and order the book. And I will always recommend you support local over the big box every day. So
100% agreed.
For a little while longer, since this is going to come out right after the book launched on September 23rd, for a little bit, you'll be able to order from Warsenal if you would like to get a limited edition JSA piece of terrain. That bundle is available. There is a measuring widget, one of our measuring sticks for Infinity, that has the Death Song cover art on it, which is behind me. And Jeff will have a copy that he can post.
And I've also done a video reviewing that specific piece of terrain from Warsenal, and it is absolutely gorgeous. So go check that video out. And that's a really cool tie-in there that they were doing. I was happy to see that.
Thanks, man. Really, really excited. The artist is a gentleman by the name of Eric from Colorado. And it all just came together organically. We were all at the Krug talking about the book, and they're like, well, let's do this. And, I didn't realize it was going to happen. I thought, we were just shooting the shit and having a good time. Yeah. But Jay and Eric kept talking and just ran with it. And it's been absolutely amazing.
Awesome.
I want to build a terrain table, and that is the centerpiece.
Yeah.
Like, it needs to happen.
Yeah. I know Jay's been working on expanding that range out so that you can get a little bit more variety to the table, but he's got a million things. Shout out to Jay, friend of the channel. He's been on a bunch.
Yeah.
He's got a million things going on, but hopefully that's going to come out soon, because that like their pre-color terrain is gorgeous, but that line of terrain in particular is one of my favorites.
Absolutely. I love it.
Yeah. What about you personally? Should people follow you on social media or anything if you decide to kind of write your own novel unrelated to Infinity or anything like that?
Well, unless some amazing, big name agent comes and picks me up, I will absolutely, everything I write will be available through Winged Hussar, and even then, it probably still will be too. The easiest place to find me would be my website, and that is talkingravens.com. That was a business I was going to start, and now I'm just too lazy to buy another URL. And so it's just my brand at this point. I've got a link tree that is /talkingravens, and then I am pretty much everywhere as the.gabriel.miller. And if you're ever playing a game like Helldivers or something, and you see somebody pop up whose username is anywhere but Iraq, that's me, and come say hi.
Very cool. Well, I'm going to go get ready to crack into the book, and maybe once I've actually read through it and it's been out on shelves for a little while, I can have you back on and we can talk a little more spoilery about the actual plot and things that happen in the novel, because that would also be very cool. We obviously have to be very careful about what we said here, but hopefully I can have you back in the future and we can chat more.
I'd love to, man.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much for coming on, and everybody go pick up the novel. I'll have links to all of the relevant stuff down in the description, so check it out and stay tuned for more.
Cheers.
I want to send a huge thank you to the extremely cool kids tier on Patreon, the Steam Powered Scoundrels, Dogmatize, Spanner Rider, Tom Likely, Rob Younce, and Russets. And thanks for watching.